The Dark Horse by Will James. Chapter 1. The Dark Horse. As it's said about a person being born with a silver spoon in the mouth, and amongst all the luxuries of life, so was Colonel, a little thoroughbred colt. There was of course no silver spoon in his mouth. When he raised his head and made a little sound, that was his first nicker. But the luxuries and care that surrounded him on his arrival amounted to the same as that of a prince in a kingdom of the horse world. Half a dozen attendants was on hand to greet him to earth. The watchful mother was taken care of as well, and soon enough, as the colt showed signs of getting to his feet, he was helped up, steadied alongside of her, and he took on his first nursing, seeming to bring him strength and steadiness like by magic. He was up and a-coming much quicker than his half-brother had. He was more bright-eyed and alert. And for that reason he was paid more attention to than the others. Another thing was his odd and different color from his half-brothers. Never once before, from the strong blood of his sire, Colonel, as the colt was later named, had got his first glimpse of light in one of the well-kept long string of steam-heated, well-ventilated box stalls. Clean straw bedding changed for him once and twice every day, and with his mother by his side to lean on and steady himself in his first waddling steps. The steady care and watchful eyes of the stableman. It soon got so the roomy box stall got plenty small as he began to romp around, and it was often bumped into. But soon the raw spring winds warmed to the sun and quieted down the light breezes. With the warm nights and days that came, the grass near popped out of the steaming earth of the pastures surrounding the rows of white stables. And then, one very bright sunny day, Colonel, the thoroughbred of thoroughbreds, blinked and sort of hesitating, and hugging his mother's side, went on with her as she was led out to a near pasture, and turned loose with him for the day. His mother right away went to grazing, but Colonel, after taking an inquisitive sniff at what she was doing, raised his head and went to blinking all around him, even straight at the sun, which blinded him for a spell, and he then sort of realized that from that bright ball is where came the light and heat. He blinked at the big shade trees that was now starting to bud, and white-painted board fence beyond it, and all around as far as he could see, which wasn't very far as yet. It was his first glimpse of Mother Earth, and being he was now quite a few days old, he was much alive in using all his senses and appreciation of the sun, the air, and the sod. Colonel wasn't the only one to get the first slant at the spring sun and the benefit of some freedom and green pasture that day. 10 and 12 more mares, with foals of about the same age as Colonel, all out of the same stable, was turned into the same pasture with him. Now, with these newcomers, was plenty more to make Colonel blink and wonder. He'd never seen another of his kind but his mother. Neither had the other colts, and all stayed close to their mother's side and sort of stared in confusion. But that wasn't to be for long. The mares, being green grass hungry, as horses are especially during springtime, went after the tender green blades as though their aim was to founder themselves. As they grazed and the colts sort of got their bearings and a little used to the brightness of the open day begin to get braver and make a few steps away from their mothers to ease their curiosity as to the other little colts and get acquainted. Colonel was about the first to step away from his mammy and come towards the colt closest to him, but he stopped halfways as the colt's mother raised her head and laid her ears back. It was only instinct that warned him of the danger of coming any closer, for he'd never seen his mother give him such a wicked look. He just stood wondering. The mare went back to grazing, and then her little colt came halfways to meet him. That seemed to be all right by the mother, and the two touched nostrils. From then on, the acquaintance was easy carried on, and now, with the company of each other, they felt braver, got to playing, running around each other and their mothers, and that started things. In a short while, the other colts that had been watching the two left their mammies, and one by one joined in. There was bowed necks as they touched nostrils, front hooves pawed the air like for handshakes, and the play was on. And being these colts was all of the thoroughbred racing blood, the play was far from slow, and even though young as they were, as they was their thoroughbred mothers of one time track fame, would have had a hard time catching up with 'em for a distance if they had a mind to. But they had no mind to, just raised their heads to watch their youngsters once in a while and went on to their grazing, knowing they'd be safe in the level and well panel-fenced pasture. Around and around went the colts, kicking up their heels, racing out a ways to turn, face one another, prance around, some with heads and tails up, and then race back, sometimes the whole bunch at once, and then branching off in pairs or fours. All the actions of good racehorse flesh was put on, with plenty of speed, rearing, twisting, and kicking, but there was no bucking. That wasn't in their blood. Trainers and stablemen took time out to gather by the fence and watch the colts' first outing, commenting on this and that colt and their possibilities. There was great things expected of these, for they was all sired by one great stallion of that stable, and which had won many big stakes and handicaps and derbies. So had some of the mares, and the colts being of such great strains should be winners. Most of 'em would be, but as is the case, not all of 'em would make the grade, and maybe only a few of them would win a big race. Maybe none or only one out of all would be a recognized big money champion. As the colts played and raced back and forth, the men by the panel fence would remark about this one and that one, and favorites was soon picked out, the colts being all straight bays and sorrels, about the same slim built and size, with hardly no white markings, but a small star in the forehead was hard to keep track of after being picked out. All but one. That one was dark brown in color, near black, and instead of only a star in his forehead like his half-brothers had, there was a long narrow blaze that ran plumb to the tip of his nose. That colt was Colonel. It was easy to pick him out from the others on account of his odd color that way, but none of the men at the fence chose him as a favorite because, even though it was only in play amongst the other colts, he never got near the lead in a straight run and sometimes trailed in last. But not much attention was paid to that, not with colts so young and only playing. After a year or so, and with some months of training, it would be easier to tell as to what could be expected, and for the time the men was passing no judgment, but only watching 'em more for the fun of it than any guessing as to how any of 'em would turn out. As Colonel played and dozed during the warm summer months that followed, he had no worries as to how he might turn out, but he did have some faint idea of what might be expected of him later on, as he watched string after string of 2-year-olds being put to their paces by their trainers, and being the track was right along the pasture, him and the other colts would sometimes race along with 'em until they come to the corner, where they would turn and race back by themselves. He got some more ideas of what to expect as he watched the paddocks where yearlings was being made to run in a circle for early training, also the full-grown stallions for their daily exercise. Then one day, along late summer, a little halter was slipped on his head, and now begin his and the others colts training to go around in circles in the paddock. Then's when he felt the first sting of a whip. That surprised him more than it stung, and after the first few times he trotted or lopped out of the reach of it. There was also the breaking to lead, and like all of his breed, he answered to that in short time. A half-hour or so of that every day made him feel some different. He might cover 10 miles or so during a day of his playing, but that short spell in the paddock struck him as mighty serious business, and where no foolishness was allowed. Like with most any kid having to go to school, he was always glad to get out of the paddock and back to the pasture to his waiting mother, nurse, and then go to grazing. He'd been eating grass for quite a few months by then. Days and weeks went on that way, with no more accidents happening to him than a slip and a fall once in a while when at play, and that didn't count. Then one day the big boss and owner of the stables, and well known at every race track the world over as a breeder of fine race horses, a shrewd trackman, and no less a person than Morgan Mansfield himself, came to the paddock where the little colts were having their short workouts. Mansfield had just got back from a long stay in foreign lands with his family, which he'd left there, and he was so anxious to get back to his ponies that he didn't bother changing from his traveling clothes, but just jumped in a car and had the chauffeur drive him around. His eyes brightened with pleasure as he went in the paddock and looked at one after another of the slick and promising-looking little colts of the spring before, every inch of 'em a thoroughbred, and living pictures in flesh of their sire, the great Montezuma, a horse who'd brought him fame along with some 100,000s on the track sale of his colts and stud fees. "What's that? How did it get in?" The trainer had to grin some. "Well, sir," he says, "I couldn't say, but he was also sired by Montezuma, and his dam is one of your best, Lady Blue. It's in the book." "Well, well," says Mansfield, puzzled. "Must be a throwback. That colt hasn't the color, action, nor resemblance of any of the others, and certainly not of Montezuma." That was true enough. The little dark brown colt with the blaze face was a little heavier in shoulder and forearms and thighs, but mighty trim and well set up. "But he looks like he has the markings of a good mile horse," says the trainer, also powerful in muddy tracks. Maybe so, said Mansfield, frowning, but I don't want this colt to be seen amongst the others, or have it be known that he's one of Montezuma's. Put him and Lady Blue in pasture number 10, with the other mixed colts there. I'll see to him. So that's how the colonel and his mammy soon found themselves in a lower and marshy pasture, where the fences wasn't so good, and the long stable was only whitewashed, all amongst big trees and pretty well hid. It was a kind of third-grade pasture, but Colonel only enjoyed the change, and being outcast from his half-brothers didn't have no effect on him. He soon made friends with some other colts of his own age there, and even though they was no kin of his, he had as much play and fun as before, only there was more flies from the marshes. But to make up for that, there was less regular nor no stiff paddock work. The chill of fall began to come. The nights got plenty cool. And Colonel's half-brother was now being kept in their luxurious box stalls during such nights, fed special and groomed, but not with Colonel, nor the ones he was pasturing with. Them was left to stay out in the pasture, and even though there was still plenty of grass, there was no special feed nor warm stalls when chilly nights come and cold winds blowed, but there was good shelter in the thick brush, and they could make out without much suffering until winter really set in, when they would be stabled and well fed, but the only heat would be from their own bodies. But before the real cold winds and snow began to come and winter did set in, Colonel was weaned from his mother, and one day loaded in a horse trailer, whizzed north some few hundred miles to big stockyards, where he was led to a stall and kept like in solitary confinement. It all happened mighty sudden, and little Colonel sure couldn't make out what this was all about, the fast and long scary ride in the trailer, then being led through stockyard lanes into a big shed-like stable, and tied up to a manger of a narrow, dark, and musty stall, had him pretty well spooked as to what would be next. Every time he'd hear footsteps come near or by his dark stall, he'd nicker soft for some kind of explaining he might understand, or at least be untied and left loose in one of the big corrals he'd passed and adjoining the many horses he'd seen in them. He'd never been tied up before, never been away from the company of other horses, and worse yet was how he missed his mother, for he hadn't been weaned away from her but only a few days, when he was taken north, away from her and his playmates, to be dumped in the dark hole where he was, all by his lonesome. The man who'd brought him north came to see him on the next day. There was another man with him. Colonel was untied, let out blinking into the sunlight, and made to trot and lope around a big square corral. This suited him fine, and he would have liked to be kept running some more to limber up after the long night's stay in the stall, but he was stopped while the two men confabbed for a spell. The stranger, a short, fat, and dark man, wearing thick glasses, made a lot of motions as he talked, then finally shook his head, put his hands in his overcoat pockets, and walked away. Another stranger was brought along later that day, and then another after that. Each time Colonel was let out of his dark stall and made to trot and lope some more in the big corral, and by the time he was through for that day he felt a little tired, more hungry and less worried. He didn't mind the dark and damp stall so much that night. The next day brought him the same chance to exercise and limber up, and at one time there was 3 strangers came, when he had to do more running around than usual. He at first wondered what this was all about, but all he got out of it was that he again felt a little tired when night come, more hungry than before, and ever since he was taken away from his home pastures, and on that 3rd night of his confinement was his first time to lay down and sleep while tied to a manger. 2 more strangers was brought along at different times the next day, and with the second one, Colonel's little heart missed a beat, and then pumped fast as that one came near. And touched him. There was no cold, far-off ways about him as with the strangers that had come before, and then, more to Colonel's surprise and pleasure, there was a good strong horse smell on that stranger's rough jacket, even on his broad brim hat. The other strangers that had come before had a smell that only made him want to wrinkle up his nose and sneeze. Colonel was left to stand as the 2 men began to talk, and then's when he figured was a good time to take a roll. He hadn't had a chance to have one since leaving the home pasture to the south. He got down to his knees to proceed to do that, when the man who'd handled him north started to make a motion to stop him, but the stranger stopped that motion, saying, "Aw, let the little feller roll. But I just groomed him good this morning." "Well, you can groom him again," grinned the stranger. So, with no interruption, Colonel went to rolling to his heart's content. The stranger squatted by the side of the corral, and rolling a cigarette, watched him. Then he spoke up sudden, while the colt was enjoying himself. "I'll give you $100 for him every time he rolls clear over." The stranger held out his hand for the other to shake, and like to bind the deal. The colt had already rolled over twice, and while the other man hesitated to take the offer, he rolled over once more. That decided him, and now hoping he would roll over once or twice more, he took the stranger's hand, saying, "That's a deal." Horses seldom roll over more than twice, but with this active colt having been tied up and not being used to that, it might be, but not at all likely that he'd go 5 times. After the 3rd time, Colonel stood up, shook himself, but all wasn't over, and the 2 men kind of held their breath in suspense as the colt went to his knees and down, like to roll over some more. It was now the stranger's turn to wish he wouldn't, and the others that he would. The stranger won, for the colt didn't roll over no more, just sort of halfways, and only scratched himself in the coral dirt. Colonel had rolled over just enough times to put over the deal and no more, but now that deal didn't seem satisfactory to the track man, and being there was no papers made to that agreement, mere words didn't count, not when the gentleman figured on getting $100 or $200 more, and he spoke up to that effect. "I'm sorry, Bo," he begins with a queer grin. Then he was interrupted. "I'm not Bo," said the stranger, sensing what was coming. "My name is Bradley Braddock, and you can make me a bill of sale for that colt to that name." "Well, be Brad," says the other man, not much disturbed. "Mine is Jerry, and what I was going to say is that I'm sorry, but I can't let you have this colt, not for 300. The man Brad was sort of dumbfounded at that, and the other, noticing the expression on his face, hurried on to explain that the colt wasn't his, that he was only selling him for somebody else whose name wasn't to be let out on account of him being so well known as ace high in race horse breeding, that this colt was sired from his best horse, had the papers to prove it, and none had brought less than $500 at 6 months of age when taken away from the dam. This colt being of odd color, the man Jerry went on, and being of different build than the others by the famous sire, is the reason why he was taken out of the country, and to be rid of on account he might reflect on the sire's blood, which would hurt with the sale of his other colts. But it was expected that even without showing the papers proving the colt's pedigree, his appearance alone showed his fine breeding, and be enough proof so he would sell for at least 1,000, much more than that could have been got by just showing the papers, but that wasn't to be done. The stranger Brad seemed to be some little impressed by the story. He was quiet for a spell when the other got through talking. Then he pointed to some corrals filled with horses some distance in the big yards. "See them horses," he says. "Well, they're the ones you seen buck at the rodeo grounds where you met me. They're going to be loaded tonight and shipped." He then pointed at the colt. "This little feller will be going along with 'em, and so far west before he's unloaded that he'll just as well be in China for all you and your boss will ever see or hear of him. Now, getting back to our deal, you and me shook hands on it, and I'm not going to let you back out. I took a chance and was willing to put out 100 more than I intended to on the colt without knowing what he is. You agreed to take a chance too, figuring the colt would roll to 4 or 5 times. You being wise to gambling on the ponies ought to be used to taking chances, and this is one time when you lost. But not altogether. You let me see the slip where you have a right to sell this colt. Write me out a bill of sale for him, and I'll split the difference with you between the 300 I was to pay you and the 500 you was doing high gambling to get." The trackman squirmed a bit at that, but he also seen where he couldn't very well squirm out, so making the best of it, he handed out the paper of release for sale of the colt. It was typed on plain paper, but the name of the stables where the colt was from and the signature of the owner of them was at the bottom, and at that the stranger's face lit up in surprise. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," he says. "Old, you bet, Mansfield's stables." "How do you know?" asked the other, also very surprised and sort of upset. "How do I know? Well, I got hurt at a rodeo in this same town a couple of years ago. I'd got to know him before once when he came west and was to a rodeo there, and other times. And when I got laid up here, there was no chance of talking him out of me coming to his place and recuperate. And now, I'll tell you what you don't want to tell me. It's that this colt's sire is none other than Montezuma. Am I right? But," he went on, "you and Mansfield don't have to worry about his identity being spread. I think a whole lot of Mansfield, and nobody will ever know, not from me, who I got this colt from, and who his sire is. I'm just going to make a good rope horse out of him, and I think he'll do fine for fast, straightaway contest work. Now, let me see his registration papers, just for my own satisfaction." They was now handed to him without hesitation, and being very satisfactory, the two then walked to the yard office. The bill of sale was written in the back of the paper, releasing the colt, witnessed and signed, and that night Colonel wasn't tied up to no manger in no dark and damp stall. Chapter 2. Go West, Young Man. A mixed freight was puffing its way across the long stretches of the Great Plains and against a cold west wind. Amongst The mixed freight cars was 6 stock cars loaded with strange stock, the kind no stockman nor farmer could or had any use for outside of one carload of top saddle horses, which no money nor love could buy, the rest was worse than useless for work of any kind besides being the dangerous to handle. They was outlaw bucking horses used in rodeos, and there they was plenty good. In other cars was mean bulls of all breeds, and for the same purpose, then wiry longhorn steers, some also used for bucking, roping, and bulldogging. It was a mixed-up bunch of wise, wild, and tough ones, and the least kind where a thin-skinned, blue-blood, thoroughbred colt would be expected to be found amongst. But sure enough, at one end of a long stock car of buckers, and partitioned off from them by stout timbers, so he wouldn't be got down and tromped on, was such a little colt. It was Colonel, headed west in that carload of toughs, the cream of the racing blood amongst the cream of the worst of the West. The first night had been a scary one for Colonel, as he was loaded, stuck away into his partition, and then the big snaky outlaws was made to come up the loading chute and into the same car with him, snorting and fighting as they came into the door. It was some more scary as the car was jerked and switching, big black steam belching, and fiery monsters of engines going back and forth close past him, and it was a good thing his partition was high and the timbers close together, or he'd gone over or through it. As it was, he had just had to stand where he was, legs wide apart, wild-eyed and trembling with fear at all the noise of the big switch-yards, shrill whistles, and blinding lights. His only bit of assurance was the close company of the big horses, and he'd every once in a while stick his little nose through the timbers and touch the one next to him with his nostrils. It eased him some that the big outlaws didn't seem nervous, nor fret none in any way, and they shouldn't, for being loaded in cars, shipped and unloaded in strange places to do their worst at different rodeos, was nothing new to the most of 'em. That was done many times a year during the contesting season, with which east of the Rockies started about July and ends about October, and west of the Rockies plumb down to Texas, where there's rodeos off and on all winter. This bunch of rodeo stock wasn't to go west of the Rockies, but would be unloaded and taken to their home range on the eastern slope of 'em for the winter, where they'd be well taken care of and be in fine shape for the following year's round of rodeos. After at last pulling out of the big noisy railroad yards, and the train began to go on its way smooth, Colonel, even though mighty puzzled at going over ground without moving a hoof, felt much less scared only when getting into some more big railroad yards again, or when some fast train would swish by, sudden, while on the way. It was a good thing he had a stout heart at such times. On the third day, and when the Great Plains was reached, was another time when his pulse beat some faster, but not from scare now. It was from the sight of, of big wide stretches of level land without a tree, nor even a bush nowheres in sight, just grass. In all his life of 6 months or so, he'd never seen such big, level, and open country. The train was doing good speed, and he'd like to go out and race with it, or better yet, with some of the playmates he'd been taken away from back in the home pastures. He didn't think he'd care to race or play with the big, mean-looking horses that was in the same car with him. They struck him as very strange in looks and action from any horse he'd ever seen. Like the big gray next to him, for instance. He'd seen him and the others run away from the sight of man when unloaded to be fed and watered in the big feed yards along the way, making queer rolling and whistling noises at 'em. The horses he knew would follow man instead of running away, and like to be petted, but not these. This big gray had already killed 2 men, and was always watching his chance to get another. Like many more in the same car, he was a natural-born outlaw, with Roman nose, small sunken eyes, heavy jaws, and tight underlip. As to his build, it was as much that of a fighter as any boxer that ever entered a ring. The others varied in size and build, but all had more or less the same earmarks of the outlaw, not made outlaws by any cruelty or mistreatment, or goaded to meanness, as some people seem to want to think, but born with a natural kink leaning that way, just as some humans are. The western horse, being raised free and wild, and with many generations of wild blood in his veins, is very independent of man. He's not like his eastern brother, who looks to man for his food and shelter, like the ancestors of Little Colonel, for instance. All the western horse wants is his freedom. He'll fight for that, and some fight so well that they finally wind up in rodeo arenas to do their stuff there. Many of them are well-bred horses nowadays, but being born free, raised in the open, and with still a little strain of the wild blood in their veins, is plenty to do the trick. Many of them want to stay that way. There's scarce cases where some horses that are willing to be good are goaded to buck and be mean. It's a good thing such cases are scarce. Such low-down, cowardly doings is very much against true cowboy principle, and never practiced by one, for there's plenty of natural, mean horses without making a good one so. As the train headed on across the plains, and a cold wind with a clean sweep blowed through the slats of the stock car, Little Colonel sort of lost his thrill at the sight of so big and level a country. All he seen in it now was how he'd like to run and play on it, and only warm up, for he was getting mighty cold. His thin hide and fine-boned body wasn't for such blasts, which seemed to go right through him. And as the day wore on, and stinging snow began to drift in, he got so cold and a-shivering that he'd been glad to take the chance of squeezing between the big outlaws for warmth. The coming night was to be still colder, and Colonel might have froze stiff, but that evening the train came to a stop at some more big stockyards, and more switch engines to scare him. With all of that, he was now shivering fit for his bones to rattle apart, when he heard a familiar voice, which he nickered at with a mighty plain sound of distress. Brad had to laugh a little at the loud and plain call for help, because that's just what he'd come for, to help him, and what made him laugh was that such a loud call from such a little feller. Also, how he showed he recognized him. It was the first time he'd nickered at his coming. The outlaw broncs only snorted as Brad had walked along the car, stopped to look through the slats at the little wild-eyed, shivering colt, and went to talking to him. "Well, little feller," he says, noticing his shivering, "it don't go so good being away from steam-heated stables this time a year, does it? Better start growing a fur coat, but hang on a spell and I'll soon fix you up with the next best." This was another feed yard, and in short time the horses and cattle was unloaded in separate pens, where plenty of hay and water was ready for them. Soon as the broncs was out of the car where the colt was, Brad came in with a couple of heavy padded horse blankets, each one big enough for two the size of Colonel, but they sure would do to cover him up well and keep him warm in most any weather, if he could stand up under the weight of 'em. He of course could, and he'd still be only the warmer if he laid down. Fastening a rope on the halter, Brad led the shivering colt out of the stall and at once put on one of his blankets, then shoved up a bucket of warm water, which he'd heated on the caboose stove, and while the colt was drinking he began to fix the blankets on him, so they'd be sure to stay. With cinches, latigos, and tie ropes from his saddle he went to work on fastening the blankets, and he had to laugh some again in trying to find the colt underneath all the covering. When he got through, all there could be seen of him was his ankles and his head, and his ankles would also be covered. When back in his stall, for Brad brought in a couple of forks full of waste hay for bedding. Also good hay for him to feed on, another bucket full of warm water, which the colt couldn't finish, and by then he'd well stopped shivering. Satisfied that the colt would now be sure enough all right, he took him back to his stall and to the fresh hay he'd put for him there, refastened the timbers good and solid, and then left him to go take care of his own self and stomach at the depot restaurant across the tracks, where two other cowboys who was along with him to take care of the stock, help load and unload 'em, was now enjoying a smoke after eating their fill. They couldn't wait for him while he took care of his urchin, they said. The stock having their fill of hay and water, many of 'em now laying down, was again stirred, loaded, and the train was once more on its way. One more feeding stop, and the stock, after another day and night on the train, would be unloaded again, this time to be trailed to their home range. Even though it was mighty cold, Colonel sure didn't feel none of it that night, not after the way Brad had bundled him so, well filled up, and no stops or switching to disturb him much. He dozed on his feet, and then, maybe on account of the weight of the blankets, he lay down to sound sleep a couple of times, and as is said, was snug as a bug in a rug. The rest of the trip was no more hardship to him, but there was still some more to come, which he had to buck through, when, after another day and night, the train came to a last stop for the stock, and all was unloaded at their home country's yards at the break of day. There was a heavy gray sky, and near a foot of snow to greet 'em. Looked like there was more to come soon, and sure enough the stock had no more than got their fill of hay and water, and little rest when it did start to snow again. Colonel, still blanketed and fed separate from the others, didn't seem to mind, not until Brad came along and stripped his pack some for travel, remarking that he'd need his cinches to put back on his saddle, and that now one blanket would do him, for he'd be keeping plenty warm, bucking through the deep snow on the rest of the way to the ranch. so he left only one blanket on him, folded it to cover him well from the withers back of his hips, and wouldn't be hindered in his traveling. Squaw hitched it on to stay, and as the buckers and saddle horses was turned out of the yards and headed on the last stretch of the trip, Colonel was led on a ways and then turned loose with them, with a grinning warning from Brad not to let any of the rough broncs chew his tail off and run him down in a snowbank. The cattle was brought along separate by a couple of other cowboys sent from the ranch, and even though the weather was plenty cold, all the stock lined out in fine shape. They was all go for travel on the hoof and limber up after so many long days and nights of standing in the cars, and all knew of the good sheltered winter range they was heading for, all except Colonel. The colt was some leery when he was turned loose to join in with the big and wicked-looking horses, and when he appeared amongst 'em, and many turned and circled around him, he figured sure his end had come. He sort of cringed, squatted, and ducked as some fought their way through the circle. To get a close look at him, and as colts do when timid in meeting strange horses, Colonel's mouth opened wide and worked much as a forced smile, and like wanting to be friendly, very much so, but Colonel didn't need to have any fear, for the big fellers hadn't been near any little colts since away the spring before. Their company was always more or less fought for, sometimes even with the colts' mothers, and they was only curious and pleased at the sight of the new blanketed little feller. The blanket around Colonel's middle at this time not only protected him from the weather, but also kept him, the big horses, from coming too close. For that blanket was something they didn't like the looks of, no more than they did a saddle or anything belonging to humans. So, keeping their distance, they only touched nostrils with him, but that was still too close to suit Colonel, and he'd tried to make a break out of reach, but there was no going through the circle that surrounded him, and he got sort of panicky. Brad stopped his horse at a distance and watched, knowing that no harm would come to the colt, and that once their curiosity was satisfied and acquaintance made, they would jog on without paying much more attention to him. But that circle was to be broke up quick, and before Brad had decided to. The big gray killer coming to see what the meeting was all about, and noticing the colt, soon scattered himself and opening to him and the colt having already been sort of acquainted through the heavy timbers of the partition in the stock car, sort of made it easy for the both getting together again, and the big outlaw, being used to see the blanket on the colt, didn't spook at it. Then the colt, recognizing his traveling partner, felt much relieved to have him near, also to see the opening in the circle. When the big gray took the lead on, Colonel was glad to follow. He followed on close by his side at first, for he felt safe near him, sensed that the big gray was the boss over the other horses, and would protect him from them. Still, not knowing he didn't need to have any fear of the others, and that any of them would also have liked to have had his company. He learned that later. Getting closer and traveling along the foothills, the snow got deeper, up to the Colonel's knees in some places, and as he began to tire, some he got behind the big gray, who proved to be not only a mighty good trail breaker, but also a brake to the wind and the stinging snow. Colonel had never been herd broke, meaning that he'd never been driven loose to any distance with a bunch of horses before. At his home pastures he'd most always been haltered and led, and if it had been tried to drive him with a bunch, he'd went where he pleased and took a good run by himself, but now it seemed very much that he should stick to the trail and the bunch with him, for he was in a very strange, big, and desolate country. The snow was deep and drifting, and he less than cared to break away from the rail of the big gray. He was now, and without his knowing, being herd broke, and would stay with the driven bunch at any time from then on, even when the grass would come green, the sun be shining warm, and he would feel like running. He got more education in herd breaking as the day wore on, with steady traveling up and down hills, winding through pine, skirting tall cliffs, and on and on. He was getting tired and began to lag behind the gray, and only the sight and fear of another horse kept close to him would make him catch up. But soon he seen that they neither would harm him, and so he lagged on. Horse after horse passed him, and he finally got so far behind as to the shoulder of Brad's horse. Brad looked down at him and grinned a little, and like an encouragement he says, "Kinda tough going, ain't it, little feller?" He reached over and patted him on the snow-covered rump. "But keep a-goin', we've got only a few miles to go, and then we'll stop for the night." The sound of Brad's voice and the feel of a human hand didn't do as was expected, for instead of jumping ahead as western-bred colts would do, Colonel stopped still in his tracks, side-glanced up at Brad, and nickered low, for right then, and as was his breeding, he'd rather have the company of humans than that of horses. Knowing horses as Brad did, horses of all kinds, he'd know more than spoke when he realized he shouldn't. Then the colt would have went on, maybe slow, but he'd went on. Now with hearing the voice and feeling the hand of a human, the blood of the colt's long line of fine-bred ancestors showed up in him mighty plain and sudden. It all at once meant security, warmth, food, and rest, and he'd stopped as if that attention would come to him right there and then. The question now was to getting him to moving on. There was no slapping him with the quirt. For one thing, Brad couldn't think of doing that, and another was that the colt was still too young to understand what that would have meant. He'd soon got to know what the sting of a whiplash meant while going through the short workouts in the paddock of his homeland. That was along with his breeding, and true to form he took to his early training natural. But here it was different. There was no paddock, nor race track, nor strings of long stables. To him a whole lot of queer things had happened since he'd been taken away from his mother only a couple of weeks before. It had been all scary and confusing. He was still confused, besides being cold, hungry, and mighty tired, and it was no wonder he was so ready to answer to Brad's touch and voice. That sort of cleared everything in his mind, and jerked him away from the nightmare he'd been plugging along on through. Now, seeing that the harm had already been done, Brad spoke to him more. "Sorry, little feller," he says. "I wish I could pick you up and carry you along, but you're too much horse, and somehow you got to make it on your own legs. Sure can't stay here." That talk had no effect on the colt, only to make him perk up his ears some, but the cold wind and stinging snow soon made him bow his head down against it some more. There he stood, and for a minute Brad didn't know just what to do. He sure wasn't any to warm himself. Finally, and talking to him some more, he started his horse, hoping the colt would follow by the sound of his voice. But outside of just raising his head and looking around like lost as Brad rode on, he made no move to follow, and that cowboy sort of lost hope. He then rode on a little farther and called to him, and that done the trick. The colt nickered, and after a while caught up with him. Brad talked as he rode on and even sang a little. He also tried to whistle for a change, but the cold had stiffened his mouth, so that was impossible. The colt came on to his talk, but mighty slow, and finally Brad, being left away behind with him, rode up to the two other riders and told them to go on with the horses, that he'd stay with the colt and try to get him into camp by dark. "All right," says one of the boys, grinning through snowbound whiskers. "How do you like your eggs for breakfast? Straight up or turned over easy?" "Yep, and should we warm up some milk for the urchin?" says the other. With only a grin for answer, Brad rode back to where he'd left the colt, and to his surprise the colt had followed his trail quite a ways and acted like he wanted to travel, but Brad wasn't to be fooled by that. He knew that the colt was near all in, had just got kind of spooked at finding himself alone, and came on the best he could. It had been then that a spark of a long unused instinct had come back to him, the instinct of trailing. Keeping at a short distance ahead, Brad talked to him. At that the colt perked up, nickered, and came on some more. He kept on a-comin', slow and staggering, but a-coming, until finally, seeing that he couldn't make it much farther, and coming to a sheltered spot amongst tall cottonwoods and a bare spot against bordering rims, Brad stopped and got off his horse. The colt edged close, smelled of the bare earth, and right away went down to his knees, then flat on his side. Brad looked down at him and then to his horse. "Well, Roper," he says, "it looks like we'll have to make camp here." "For a spell. Good thing we're at least on a bare spot and in good shelter. Going to dig up a little heat now." With all the dead, dry timber and branches close by, it was no time when a fire was built and the crackling of it went to echoing along the sheltering rim and trees on the deep wash. The colt blinked at the fire a bit, felt its warmth. Then his eyes closed and he went to a sound sleep. Roper followed suit by cocking one leg and snoozed standing up. Then, taking one look at the two, and not to be outdone, Brad drug a few more heavy limbs across the fire. They'd do for a long time, curled up to within arm's reach of the colt, and also was soon asleep. It was near dark when he woke up. The fire had burned low, and throwing some light branches on it, soon had it going again. He rolled a smoke while noticing the colt's eyes again, blinking at the light and fresh blaze of the stirred fire. Soon he stretched at the warmth, and at that there was hope he'd be able to make it the rest of the way into camp. Roper had hardly moved a hoof, but now was wide awake and looked like as much as to say, "When do we eat?" Warmed up some more, and seeming more rested, the colt raised his head and began looking around. "That's the spirit," says Brad to him. "Now stand up on them long legs of yours and let's move on." The colt didn't stand up at just that. He only yawned wide and like he could sleep some more. But Brad had other ideas. He walked to him, felt of the thick blanket, which was now dry and warm, and then slapped him on the rump, saying, "Get up, you lazy bum." The first slap didn't do no good, neither did the order. It took a couple more slaps and stiffer orders, and then the colt, seeing the cowboy meant it, finally got to his feet, bowed his neck, stretched some more, and by that Brad took hope he'd easy enough make it the rest of the way in, he'd thought. But the weather, and now still deeper snow, had to be accounted for, and Brad, after getting out of the shelter and warmth of the fire, seen that a near blizzard was sweeping across the country. It had also got even colder. The tracks of the other horses was drifted over, and now, with the blinding snow, which would have to be faced, Brad couldn't expect the colt to follow by just talking to him, for the talk couldn't have been heard in the howling wind. So the next best, which would be the only sure way not to lose him in the storm, would be to lead him, fastening a lead rope to his halter, straightening up the blanket to stay, and for all protection possible, Brad moved him around some to sort of limber him up and get him ready to face the outside. Then, getting on his horse, the outfit started out. As Brad figured, it was only now about an hour's ride to camp, but in this weather, and with the colt's slow traveling against the storm and deep snow, it would be at least 2 hours before it could be reached. But there the colt sort of surprised him, for he let up and bucked the storm in good shape. The rest and warming up had sure done its work, and if there'd been some nourishment in his tummy, he'd done still better. As Brad rode along, cold, head bent against the storm, he thought of just that, nourishment, no, not so much for himself as for the colt and roper. There was no hay for the horses, nor stable, or even a shed where he was headed for to spend the rest of the night. The place was just a line camp, and the only building on it was a one-room, dirt-roof log cabin, with stove, grub, and bunks. There was of course a round corral, and a good-sized fenced-in pasture, where standing feed was saved for the riders' horses, also for whatever stock was wanted held there on the way to or from the shipping point. There was also good shelter in the pasture, but as Brad rode on, the blizzard getting fiercer and hardly being able to see any farther than his horse's ears, he kept a-wondering about the colt and how he'd make out in that storm for the rest of the night and the next day. And the colt, like steady reminding, was now beginning to tug more and more on the rope. He was fast getting tired again, but there could be no more stopping, for being there was no kind of shelter until camp was reached. Stopping would mean sure freezing to death. As it was now, with the blinding storm and darkness, nothing to go by, excepting the direction of the wind, which might change at any time and cause the rider to go astray. It would have to be more than luck if the line camp was located. No stranger could have, for even with Brad, as well as he knew the country, there was none of it for him to see so as to recognize, and he depended most altogether on Roper's judgment and instinct to find camp. That horse had made the trip many times from the ranch to the shipping point and back, and a compass would have been more than useless as compared to him there. Brad had rode many long miles in that country, miles that, when thirsty, hungry, or cold, seemed more like 5 than 1, but these last few miles that night was the longest he'd ever rode, for he now had more than himself to consider. The colt was steady, hanging back more and more on the rope, and weaving from side to side in his tracks, as though he might fall any time. Brad worried with fear that he would, for if he did, it would about be impossible to get him up and going again, and there being no shelter nor anything to make a fire in that particular bleak and open stretch, it would sure mean the end of him. There would be no way of even hauling him in. With the lead rope to the saddle horn, Roper was near dragging the colt, step by step and very slow, when at last Brad faintly seen the line camp's fence, and no sight had ever meant so much to that cowboy, none that he could have thought of right then. On account of the storm being so thick, Roper had been the first to see, or sense, the fence, and along it he went pulling the colt until, finally, the gate was reached. Once there, and coming to a stop to open the gate, Brad knew what would happen, and it did. Roper no more than stopped pulling on the rope, when down went the colt, and this time it looked like to stay. But Brad wouldn't have it that way, not when he finally had him so close to home. He went to work on him, and slapped him hard from neck to rump to keep the blood circulating, and to get him up, and at last, with a couple more slaps along the neck, some talking to, another pull. On the lead rope, the colt straightened his front legs. Brad pulled some more, and he stood up again. There was no taking any chances of letting him get down no more, and being the cabin was only a couple of 100 yards away, he made for it, pulling on the rope for all he was worth, Roper dragging the bridle, reins, and following. There was no stop again, not even when the cabin door was reached, for Brad made a lunge for it, jerked on the latch string at the same time, and in he went, pulling the colt inside right after him. Then he closed the door. "Where's them fried eggs?" he hollered at the other riders, as they'd jumped up at the sudden commotion, lit a candle, and rubbed their eyes at the sight of the snow-covered man and colt.